Hello everybody, Dr. Carol Blaney here. This is my cat who wants to be in the video today. Well, I would like to continue on with my They Say, I Say series, where I talk about great minds, what they've said about the nature of reality, and then how that fits in or contrasts with my theory of etheric flux. The Blaney theory of etheric flux is what I call it. Now, just watched a video entitled The Best Dr. Bohm Interview, where he states the contradiction of quantum theory with relativity. Now, we all know this, but I'll just go ahead and summarize it the way Bohm did, that relativity is local, causal, deterministic, and continuous. And quantum theory is non-local. It definitely has discrete jumps. It has randomness. And it is non-continuous as opposed to continuous. And these theories, Bohm goes on to say, are contradictory. However, because one is in the large scale and the other's in the small scale. How can we invent or devise or conceive of equations that would bridge the two? There's only a general field, according to Einstein, one general field. And actually this agrees with etheric flux for sure. Particles are concentrated regions of the field which spread out through the universe, agrees with etheric flux. So a particle is more of an abstraction in the same way that, say, a Chagall painting is an abstraction of reality, or even an abstraction of an abstraction, which is an abstraction of a dream. So there's only a whole field which is undivided according to Einstein, and we call that undivided wholeness. So we label Einstein's as an undivided wholeness. Now, quantum, on the other hand, energy exists in the form of indivisible quanta. The entire movement of the universe is based on unbreakable links, including the observer and the observed. So Bohm started from the whole continuous field, as Einstein agreed with, and also the parts are abstractions of the whole, and they have no independent existence. This is where quantum mechanics and general relativity agree, that the parts are abstractions and they have no independent existence. So, just a minute. My cat, kitty. My kitty is on my computer. While he's here, I just like you to say hello to Schroeder. We're going to also say that Bohm gave the example of two whirlpools in water, kind of representing the nature of a particle. Now, this is exactly what I used in my own etheric flux theory, so I was really delighted to hear that Bohm himself said this. And that means that my own work, which kind of stemmed off of Einstein's general relativity, which I really feel is a real phenomenon, but the only problem is that it doesn't express itself properly at small fields. So we have to go to small scales in order to find the mathematics of what happens to this flowing ether, which is what Einstein proposed. He didn't call it that. It's called warped space-time, but the same thing. Is just calling it something different because talking about an etheric flow or etheric fluid that flows is more visceral, and it allows us to make the mathematics much more simple and understandable, and also we can illustrate it in 2D by having a 3D diagram on a 2D plane that moves in time. So we can observe it as 3D plus time. Now, so Bohm was saying that atoms are similar to the two whirlpools in water, and they may interact one way or another. The entire universe is built this way from small to large. I totally agree, and this is where my theory came. The thing that I was excited about and why I'm making this video is because now I'm adding Bohm and Einstein into my They Say, I Say, so that I can point out what each of these people said, and then where do you go from there? So apparently these are the two people that are the closest to what I'm proposing. And nothing I say disagrees with either. It's just that I think about it as doing what they would have done if they could have lived longer, or if I could have worked with them. So I consider them both my mentors. Early on the work, I had a lot of internal dialogues with Einstein in my mind that helped me move forward in the theory. So that's going to change now. I'll have both Einstein and Bohm in my thought palace to have conversations with when I get stuck. I'll go there and have conversations with them. It's a wonderful shamanic type device where you use your imagination to heal or to, in my case, solve problems. The electric field, gravity, and I'm adding the strong and weak nuclear fields, as well as dark energy and dark matter, can all be explained with this single field that carries everything, including matter. Matter is one with this field. Matter has a certain property. Okay, I'm quoting Bohm here. Matter has a certain property that is much more concentrated or something. So he kind of knows how it has to be, but he didn't say anything beyond that, at least not in this interview. Sadly, the interview didn't give a date of when, but he looked fairly young, so he might have been between 50 and 60 maybe in the interview. He was wearing his glasses, his cool beatnik glasses that are sort of trapezoid shaped. You know, the tortoiseshell ones? Yeah, so that era of his life, that was when he was interviewed. Let's see. So, at least at the time of this interview, it implied he had no clue how that unified field would express matter. But then again, that's where the Blaney theory of etheric flux takes its position among the dialogue. And that's where I'll explain right now using my chalkboard that cost $1. Here we go. So, we're talking about a unified field. It is a fluid, and I'm a chemical engineer. That's where I got my doctorate degree at University of Delaware. And at the time, some people were asking this, so I just wanted to say at the time it was the third highest rated chemical engineering department in the country of the United States. It might have been international, but whatever. At least it was the U.S. And so I didn't know that when I went there. I was just a dumb student going to school, getting my degree, and I was like, wow, we're the number third in the nation, up there with Stanford and Harvard and Caltech and blah, 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 all these places. And I was really glad to work with Dr. Pigford. So anyway, that's my background, fluid mechanics in particular. And so it would follow that I would look at the physics dilemma from my point of view, and I'm offering, I think, a very usable, workable solution that basically takes Einstein's work, but by changing what we call things, allows us to see it in our minds. And that way we don't have to do any math to explain the gist of it today, okay? So the fluid is viscosity equals 0, the density equals 0, and its turbulence, which I call tau, is approaching infinity because a quiescent fluid is extremely unstable. In fact, it's so infinitely unstable that it really can't exist. So even if you did one tiny perturbation in it, it would flow massively wildly and start making a lot of natural flow patterns, such as eddies and whirlpools and other curved forms. Some of those curved forms will be stabler than others, and at all size scales. So you would notice if you were very small, you know, like compared to us, if you're very small, you would see a light wave forming, and it would look like a tornado that its tip is going at the speed of c, according to our viewpoint and our instruments. That's what we would measure. So if you take this conical light wave that has a handedness and you warp the space-time around it, to use conventional language, or in my language, if you have an etheric flux flow pattern that it may flow into, and its pattern would be superimposed on the local pattern that caused it to fold its head onto its tail. Kind of like if you were in a windstorm, you might get contorted to where your head might actually touch your foot, okay, because you're in a tornado and it's contorting your body. So that's what's happening in, for example, the Big Bang or some other explosive or situation inside a star or whatever, but mainly the Big Bang or some other high energy situation. And what happens is that it turns out that the tornadic flow of the photon has an inward flow of the accelerating ether into it. Okay, so the ether, which is filled with all size scales of whorls and swirls, as I call it, you can call those, and I like to call those, fairy dust particles, because they pop into and out of existence. Some of them remain longer than others, such as light photons remain longer than some of the virtual particles that we see disappear right before our eyes. However, if you shrunk yourself small enough, you might see entire universes. Your time scale would be much faster compared to ours, and an entire universal lifespan of an entire universe would pass by before our blink of an eye for us, but it would be very long to that small particle because things move faster at the small scales. And there's probably, and I'm postulating that there is, I'm actually asserting that there is a lot of information exchange that goes on at those small scales. And since it goes down to 0 psi scale, which is basically an infinite nested series of curved flow patterns, which all have gyroscopic inertia and complexity, and we might call it chaos, but it does have order, like chaos has order. Just it's not apparent to the naked eye that chaos has order, but there is an order there. I believe Bohm would say that was a, let me look at my notes. He kind of uses unfolded and folded the opposite way I would use it, but so yeah, his order is, let's just call it the folded / unfolded order that's hidden from us, but it's there. And in that particular video I mentioned earlier, he gave that example of 2 concentric cylinders filled with glycerin, and when you twist the outer cylinder and the inner cylinder stays stationary, and then you place a drop of carbon ink in there, it forms a strand, you know, like as the cylinders move because of the laminar flow between the 2 tubes. And then if you reverse the flow of the tubes back to their original position, that strand goes back to the perfect single dot. And that illustrates, as Bohm puts it, his folded and unfolded nature of all particles with all other particles. And of course, particle being an abstraction, all flows connected to all other flows in this ether. But I digress. My point was that these small flow patterns in the ether, I call them fairy dust. So that, and the reason I call them that is for fun, and also for, it's easy to remember that fairy dust sort of hovers because it's going in a circle, whereas a light wave is more like an angel, and it flies really, really fast in one direction. And its inertia is spread out as it goes past. It sucks in the ether as it moves through the universe. But this, like if you have the light wave in its circular form, which I call the toroidal-shaped light ring, not unlike Wheeler's Geon, but I believe my math shows that mine is stable, and he said his wasn't. So that's what an electron looks like. And if you had a fairy dust particle, it would float in to the electron and kind of start going into that circular pattern that it would have gone into the photon. So if you had the mathematics for the photon, you can just do a transformation on it to make it go into a circular pattern, and that would give you the math for the toroid. So that's why the math of the photon is so important, and that's why I've focused my work on this mathematics, knowing that I can apply a circular transformation to it to make this. And at that point, I will hire a graduate student to do that. That's my dream anyway. But if I don't live that long, then maybe somebody will watch this and do that work. Because I think it's beautiful work and it explains reality pretty well. So the fairy dust particles, if you were an angel and you were flying alongside a photon because I assert that angels fly at the speed of light because they're light beings. So if you float, if you're an angel and you're flying next to a photon, you would see the fairy dust in the etheric soup, or what we call the 0 point field, or the 0 point energy. Those fairy dust particles would be caught in the, I guess you would call it the wave pattern of the photon, and they would sort of flow and follow a certain pattern. And the thing that determines where that fairy dust particle flows is its initial velocity, and with respect to the photon, and the acceleration vector field pattern that defines that photon. And there's an acceleration vector field pattern that defines the toroid as well. Now, all of this agrees with Einstein and Bohm on every possible way, except for I did not see them propose the actual flow pattern of an etheric fluid, you know, because I'm using the fluid analogy to move forward with the math. Because without some thing that you have to call it something in order to write an equation for it. So I'm calling it a fluid. You could call it an imaginary fluid, but it's still a fluid with 0 viscosity and 0 density. Or you could say, if you wanted to be rigorous, what is a fluid as the viscosity approaches 0 and the density approaches 0 and the turbulence approaches infinity? What kind of fluid would that be? That's the fluid I'm proposing. Call it an imaginary fluid if you like, because it really is imaginary. It can't exist with no movement. Anyway, so the fairy dust particles would have these trajectories that were dictated by the etheric vector field that defines that photon, which incidentally is superimposed on all the other vector fields of all the other particles in the whole universe. But it doesn't mean that the photon doesn't have its own specific acceleration field, vector field pattern that is associated with the photon. And it carries that vector field pattern through space at the speed of light c. Well, I think that I have kind of explained how theory of etheric flux connects Einstein and Bohm's desire to make this unified field using a continuous field, and then how do you do the math. And so I hope that I can do a preliminary description of the math of a photon that is expressed by the movement of this fluid as well as its vector field pattern. But I will probably start, for simplicity, to show the pressure distribution of the 0 point field in the photon so you can get more of a feel of what the photon is, why it does itself propel itself through space. It's got a high pressure region and a low pressure region, just like a soliton wave on the surface of water that goes forever and ever and never stops. That was what inspired me to understand that a photon is a tornadic version of that, or a vortex version of that. Same principle, self-sustaining. And because it's self-sustaining, so is the toroid. And it has an extra thing of self-sustaining phenomenon by its sucking itself in its own gravitational field. Gravitational field being, of course, the etheric acceleration vector field pattern that it comprises. So I guess that will be everything I wanted to say today. So in the same interview, David Bohm said that he was working on the algebra that would extend the math to make quantum physics and general theory agree. And I would like to do that, but starting with the visceral form so that anyone, a layperson or the most brilliant physicist in the world, would know what I was saying, and even the most brilliant physicist in the world, or one of them, would be able to take what I'm saying, especially if they knew about fluid mechanics and the spirit of the Navier-Stokes equations. The spirit of, because the Navier-Stokes equations are based on an ideal fluid, and of course, how can a fluid like this be an ideal fluid? But, so using the spirit of the Navier-Stokes equations, we want to make that match. The Schrodinger equations for the light wave, Schrodinger equation for a light wave, that is. And preferably the Schrodinger equation of an electron, although it may need to be tweaked because no one has ever proposed, except in some of the newer heuristical things that I've seen. There are people proposing this toroid, because I did searches on toroidal electrons, and there are some proposals, which is to me very, very exciting, because if I'm not the only one thinking about it, then it's probably got merit. So that's very exciting for me. And then we have, of course, the toroidal electrons that we do experiments with, and then I also assert that there's smaller ones with that same flow pattern. And in fact, there's a huge, huge, huge ones. Black holes, I assert, are toroidal in shape, and if this is your sort of toroid and you sort of have some flow, a certain handedness of the flow, and of course a fairy dust particle out here would be pulled into it because of the condensed nature of its pulling in of the ether, and it would flow something like this, and then it would get narrower and narrower, and then it would just go around and around forever, but still be going in a spiral pattern related to the golden spiral, because that's the only flow that exists, the only pattern that exists that's the same at all size scales. So because of this flow, like if you drew fairy dust particles coming in, there's going to be some here that come in, some of it out here is coming in, but there's some way up here that come in, and then there's some that are forced out, like that. And that looks like the drawings of, the black hole. They draw a black hole, they don't know what it is, and then it has this Hawking radiation coming out or something at the top. And that's supposed to be an arrow. Okay, so that should match, but I'm saying this is a more accurate picture of the toroidal nature of the black hole. An electron is a little black hole. In fact, Nassim Haramein used to call, in the video that I saw of him, mini black holes. I think he said a proton was a mini black hole, but I'm working with the simplest shape. And an electron that has one particular handedness is the electron. The positron would be the opposite handedness. But anyway, the electron is a mini black hole. So, and if you get so close to the electron, a fairy dust particle would be pulled in. So, just like in a big black hole. It does have an event horizon. All right. Well, thank you for letting me share my thoughts with you. I look forward to many more. I'm just getting started. I have so much more to share, so much more, years and years of thinking about this, and sometimes I feel a little incomplete when I only focus on one thing, and I feel like, well, I didn't cover all this other stuff, so I'll just keep making videos, and informally, and peace everybody, and may physics be with you, whatever that means.